She'll never know what hit her. Literally. That's what my husband Oscar whispered to his accomplice while I lay unconscious in my hospital bed, believing he'd successfully poisoned me like his 3 previous wives. What he didn't know was that my family's $500 million trust was about to activate on my 35th birthday in 6 days, transferring complete control to me. By the time I woke up and discovered he'd drained our accounts, I had access to more money than he could steal in 10 lifetimes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story, and I used every penny of it to destroy him. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital's ICU hummed overhead. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, my body fighting against whatever poison Oscar had slipped into my anniversary dinner 3 days earlier. Through the haze of medications and the fog of illness, I could hear voices, familiar voices that chilled me more than the IV fluids coursing through my veins. The bank called this morning. Oscar's voice carried that smooth, confident tone I'd fallen in love with 2 years ago during our whirlwind courtship. They needed confirmation for the wire transfers. I explained that Marianne had given me power of attorney before her condition worsened. A woman's laugh, sharp, calculating. I didn't recognize it, but there was something predatory in the sound. How much did you manage to get out before they started asking questions? Everything liquid. About $800,000 from her personal accounts, plus another $200,000 from the joint savings we opened after the wedding. Oscar's voice moved closer to my bed, and I felt his presence looming over my still form. The investment accounts will take longer to liquidate, but her broker thinks she's too sick to handle her own finances now. Dr. Mitchell's report about her deteriorating neurological function really sold the story. My heart monitor should have given me away, the way my pulse spiked at hearing my own husband discuss stealing my life savings, but somehow I managed to keep my breathing steady, my body limp. Years of practicing meditation and yoga had taught me control I never imagined would save my life. "What about the family money?" the unknown woman asked. "You said there was a trust." Oscar's footsteps moved away from my bed toward the window. "That's where it gets complicated, Angel. The trust doesn't activate until her 35th birthday, which is—" I could hear papers rustling. "6 days from now, but here's the beauty of it. If she dies before then, it reverts to distant cousins. She's never met. No inheritance for a dead woman." Angel. The name sent ice through my veins. I'd heard Oscar mention an angel before, his business associate who helped him with investment opportunities. Now I understood what kind of business they were really in. "Are you sure the dosage was right this time?" Angel's voice carried a note of impatience. "We can't afford another recovery like what happened with Harriet in Portland. 3 months of her fighting back before the pneumonia finally took her. Harriet. Another name. Another woman." My mind raced even as my body remained motionless. How many of us had there been? "The ricin concentration was perfect," Oscar replied with the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather. Dr. Mitchell confirmed the symptoms matched severe food poisoning progressing to organ failure. Natural causes, just like with Jane, in Denver and Cooper's widow in Phoenix. 3 cities, 3 women, 3 deaths that weren't accidents. "Her pulse is getting weaker," Angel observed, and I realized she must be looking at my monitors. "How long does Mitchell think she has?" 48 to 72 hours, according to his latest assessment. The neurological damage is accelerating, exactly as planned. By the time the trust would have activated, there won't be anyone left to activate it for. I'd married a serial killer. The charming businessman who'd swept me off my feet at my friend's wedding, who'd proposed after just 6 months of dating, who'd insisted we open joint accounts to build our future together. He was a predator, who'd done this before. Multiple times. But there was something Oscar didn't know, something even I had barely thought about in the chaos of our sudden marriage and my subsequent illness. The trust wasn't just any family money, it was the Morrison family trust, established by my great-grandfather who'd built a shipping empire in the early 1900s. $500 million, managed conservatively for decades, growing and compounding, waiting for the next Morrison heir to reach 35 years of age. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 28, making me the sole remaining direct descendant. The trust had seemed like a distant thing, something I'd worry about when I reached middle age. I'd been so focused on building my own career as a graphic designer, on creating a life with Oscar, that I'd barely given it serious thought. The funeral arrangements? Angel asked. Already planned. I've been the grieving husband making preparations all week. The life insurance alone will be substantial, but it's really just bonus money at this point. Her personal accounts were the main prize. You've gotten better at this, Angel said, and I could hear approval in her voice. Remember how sloppy you were with your first wife in Seattle? That detective almost figured it out. 4 cities, 4 women. How had this monster evaded justice for so long? Practice makes perfect, Oscar chuckled, the sound making my skin crawl. Plus, having a doctor willing to sign off on natural causes for the right price makes everything much smoother. Dr. Mitchell, my own physician, was part of this. The man I'd trusted with my life had been helping Oscar plan my death. As their conversation continued, detailing the logistics of liquidating my remaining assets and disappearing before anyone could investigate, I forced myself to remain perfectly still. But my mind was racing, calculating, planning. They thought they had 48 hours before I died. They thought they'd stolen everything I had. They were wrong on both counts. The trust activation wasn't just about age. It was about need. The Morrison family had built safeguards into their fortune, recognizing that emergencies and threats could arise before the designated birthday. If a Morrison heir faced extraordinary circumstances threatening their life or livelihood, an emergency, clause could trigger early activation. Being poisoned by your husband while he systematically stole your life savings definitely qualified as extraordinary circumstances. And while Oscar had found my obvious accounts, he had no idea about the network of financial advisors, lawyers, and family friends who'd been managing the Morrison Trust for decades. People who'd known me since childhood. People who would move heaven and earth to protect the last of the Morrison line. But first, I had to survive the next 48 hours. I had to let Oscar think his plan was working while I figured out how to contact the outside world without alerting him or his accomplices. As their voices faded and footsteps retreated from my room, I remained perfectly still, letting them believe their victim was dying according to schedule. But inside, I was very much alive, very much aware, and very much planning their destruction. Oscar had chosen his final target. He just didn't know it yet. The irony wasn't lost on me as I lay there pretending to be dying. 2 years ago, I'd been the happiest I'd ever been, finally ready to move forward after years of focusing solely on my career. My graphic design studio in downtown Seattle was thriving. My client list included major tech companies, and I just bought my dream loft in Pioneer Square with the proceeds from a particularly lucrative branding contract. I'd never wanted to rely on the Morrison family money. Growing up, I'd watched what inherited wealth had done to my cousins. Some became entitled and lazy. Others lived in constant fear of losing it. My parents, Robert and Catherine Morrison, had raised me with the understanding that the trust was a safety net, not a lifestyle. Build your own life first, my father always said. The family money will be there when you truly need it. At 33, I thought I'd proven myself. My design studio employed 6 people. We'd won 3 industry awards, and I'd never touched a penny of Morrison money beyond what my parents had left me when they died. A modest $2 million inheritance that I'd invested conservatively. The trust seemed like something for my future children to worry about. Then I met Oscar at my college roommate's wedding in Vancouver. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was charming in that effortless way that made everyone around him feel special. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to see right through you and a smile that could light up a room. He told me he was in import-export, traveling frequently between Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland for business deals. "You have the most beautiful laugh," he'd said during our first dance, having somehow convinced me to leave my +1 at the bar. "It's like music." I should have been suspicious when he pursued me so intensely after that weekend. Daily calls, flowers delivered to my office, surprise visits that always seemed perfectly timed when I was feeling stressed or lonely. But after years of casual dating and focusing on my career, having someone want me that desperately felt intoxicating, Oscar made everything feel like an adventure. Weekend trips to Victoria Island, spontaneous dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, but that always turned out to be perfect. Little gifts that showed he'd been listening to things I'd mentioned in passing. He had this way of making me feel like I was the center of his universe. "I've never met anyone like you, Marianne," he'd whispered during a walk along Alki Beach 6 months after we met. "You're independent, successful, beautiful, and you don't need anyone to take care of you. That just makes me want to take care of you even more." The proposal came during a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands. He'd arranged everything perfectly: a private boat charter, dinner on the deck as the sun set over the water, a ring that was exactly what I would have chosen for myself. Not too flashy, not too traditional, but undeniably beautiful. "I know, it's fast," he'd said, dropping to one knee as tears streamed down my face. "But when you know, you know. And I know I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you make me." I said yes, without hesitation. Looking back now, I realized that was exactly what he'd been counting on. The wedding planning revealed the first small cracks in the perfect facade, though I'd rationalized them away at the time. Oscar was insistent about certain things. We had to use his friend's catering company. His business associate Angel would handle the photography, and he wanted us to open joint accounts immediately to simplify the finances. "It's just practical," he'd explained when I'd hesitated about combining our money so quickly. "We're going to be married. What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine. Besides, my business requires a lot of international transfers. Having accounts in both our names will make things easier." I'd given in because I loved him, because the wedding planning was stressful enough without fighting about bank accounts, and because part of me wanted to prove I could be a trusting wife. The Morrison family tendency toward financial paranoia had always embarrassed me. I didn't want to be one of those rich people who couldn't trust anyone. So I'd added Oscar's name to my personal checking and savings accounts, the ones that held the money I'd inherited from my parents, plus the profits from my business. The trust, of course, remained untouchable until my 35th birthday, but I'd never even mentioned it in detail. Oscar knew I came from old Seattle money, but I'd downplayed the extent of it. Our first year of marriage had been everything I'd dreamed of. Oscar traveled frequently for work, which gave me space to maintain my independence and focus on my business. When he was home, he was attentive and romantic. We talked about buying a house together, maybe starting a family in a few years, taking a big anniversary trip to Europe. But small things started to nag at me. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Business trips that lasted longer than expected with vague explanations. Credit card statements that showed charges in cities he hadn't mentioned visiting. When I asked about these things, Oscar always had reasonable explanations delivered with just enough irritation to make me feel guilty for doubting him. "You're starting to sound like you don't trust me," he'd said after I'd questioned a weekend trip to Portland that had somehow cost $3,000 according to our joint credit card statement. "Marriage is about trust, Marianne. If you can't trust your husband, what do we have?" I'd apologized and dropped it, hating the way his disappointment made me feel. I loved him. I wanted our marriage to work. So I'd pushed down the doubts and focused on the good parts of our relationship. The poisoning happened on our second anniversary. Oscar had insisted on cooking dinner himself, something special, he'd said, to celebrate how far we'd come. He'd made my favorite pasta dish, opened an expensive bottle of wine, and even bought flowers for the table. To us, he'd toasted, looking into my eyes with what I'd believed was genuine love. To everything we've built together, and everything we're going to build in the future. I'd felt the first symptoms about an hour after dinner. Nausea, dizziness, a burning sensation in my throat. Oscar had been so concerned, so caring as he'd helped me to the car and driven me to the emergency room. She has severe food allergies, he'd told the intake nurse, his voice perfectly calibrated with worry. She must have eaten something contaminated. Please, you have to help her. For 3 days, I'd drifted in and out of consciousness as my body fought against whatever he'd given me. Oscar had been by my bedside constantly, playing the devoted husband perfectly, bringing flowers, talking to doctors, holding my hand while I was unconscious. And the whole time, he'd been systematically emptying our accounts and planning my funeral. Now, as I lay there listening to the hospital sounds around me, machines beeping, nurses talking in the hallway, the distant sounds of the city beyond the windows, I realized how perfectly he'd played me. The whirlwind romance, the insistence on joint accounts, the timing of the poisoning just days before my 35th birthday, and the trust activation. But Oscar had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that a woman who'd lived modestly and built her own business was just another victim to be manipulated and discarded. He had no idea what the Morrison family was capable of when one of their own was threatened. In 6 days, I would legally control more money than Oscar could spend in several lifetimes, but I didn't have 6 days to wait. I had maybe 48 hours before whatever poison he'd given me overwhelmed my system entirely, which meant I needed to act fast, and I needed to be very, very smart about it. The anniversary dinner had started like something out of a romantic movie. Oscar had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen, shooing me away whenever I tried to help, insisting this was his gift to me. The dining room was transformed with candles, fresh orchids, my favorite flowers, and the good china we'd received, as wedding gifts but rarely used. 2 years, he'd said, pulling out my chair with a flourish. Has it been everything you dreamed it would be? I'd laughed, settling into my seat and admiring the spread he'd prepared. Lobster ravioli in a cream sauce that smelled divine, crusty bread from the Italian bakery downtown, and a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Better than I dreamed, I'd answered honestly. Though, I have to admit, I'm impressed by your hidden culinary skills. When did you learn to make ravioli from scratch? YouTube University. Oscar had grinned, that boyish smile that had first caught my attention at the wedding 2 years ago. Plus, I may have gotten some tips from the chef at Casino when I picked up the wine. He remembered us from last year. Last year's anniversary dinner at Casino had been magical, one of those perfect Seattle evenings where the restaurant's terrace overlooked Elliott Bay and the sunset painted everything golden. Oscar had surprised me with a weekend trip to Victoria Island afterward, just the two of us exploring the gardens and staying at that charming bed and breakfast. This year, he'd wanted to stay home. More intimate, he'd said. Just us, no distractions, no servers interrupting our conversation every 5 minutes. The ravioli was incredible, rich and creamy with just a hint of herbs I couldn't identify. Oscar had opened the champagne with a practiced pop, filling our glasses while telling me about his latest business trip to Vancouver. The Peterson deal finally came through, he'd said, raising his glass. That shipping contract we've been working on for months. It's going to mean some significant changes for us, Marianne. Good changes. I'd been curious about the Peterson deal for weeks. Oscar's import-export business had always been somewhat mysterious to me. Lots of phone calls conducted in other rooms, trips that lasted longer than expected. clients whose names he mentioned but whom I never met. But he'd been so excited about this particular contract that I'd assumed it must be a major breakthrough. Changes how? I'd asked, taking a sip of the champagne. It was excellent, dry and crisp with tiny bubbles that tickled my nose. More travel, probably, some longer trips to coordinate the logistics, but also more money, which means we can finally start looking at houses seriously, maybe start thinking about kids in a few years. We'd talked about children before, always, in vague future terms. Oscar had said he wanted to wait until his business was more established, until we were more financially secure. I'd been fine with that. My design studio was at a crucial growth phase, and I wasn't ready to step back. Yet. To the future, Oscar had toasted, his eyes holding mine across the candle-lit table. To everything we're building together. I'd clinked my glass against his, feeling that warm glow of contentment that came with being exactly where you wanted, to be with exactly who you wanted to be with. The pasta was delicious, the champagne perfect, and my husband was looking at me like I was the most beautiful woman in the world. The first sign something was wrong came about 20 minutes into dinner, a slight burning sensation in my throat, which I'd initially attributed to the champagne bubbles. Then my stomach started to feel unsettled, a queasy rolling that made me push my plate away despite how good the food tasted. "You okay, sweetheart?" Oscar had asked, his voice immediately concerned. "You look a little pale." "I think I might be getting sick," I'd said, pressing my hand to my forehead. It felt warm, but not necessarily feverish. "Maybe I'm just tired. It's been a long week at the studio." Oscar had gotten up immediately, coming around to feel my forehead with the back of his hand. "You do feel warm. Maybe we should get you some water. See if that helps." But the water didn't help. Within another 10 minutes, the nausea had intensified to the point where I was gripping the edge of the table, trying not to vomit all over our anniversary dinner. My vision was starting to blur slightly, and there was a strange metallic taste in my mouth that hadn't been there before. "Something's really wrong," I'd managed to say, and Oscar had immediately shifted into crisis mode. "Okay, we're going to the hospital," he'd said, helping me stand on legs that suddenly felt unsteady. "Can you walk? Should I carry you?" The drive to Mercy General was a nightmare of increasing symptoms. The nausea gave way to actual vomiting, though there wasn't much in my stomach to bring up. My head was pounding, my vision kept going in and out of focus, and there was a burning sensation spreading through my chest that made it hard to breathe. Oscar had called ahead while driving, one hand on the wheel and one holding his phone. "My wife is very sick," I'd heard him saying. "She has severe food allergies, and I think she might have eaten something contaminated. We're 5 minutes out." Food allergies. I'd never had severe food allergies in my life. The only thing I was even mildly sensitive to was shellfish, which gave me a minor rash if I ate too much of it. But I was too sick to correct him, too focused on not passing out in the passenger seat. The emergency room had been a blur of activity. Nurses taking my vital signs, doctors asking questions I couldn't focus enough to answer properly, Oscar providing medical history that seemed more detailed than it should have been. "She's always been sensitive to certain preservatives," I'd heard him telling Dr. Mitchell, the attending physician. "And she's been under a lot of stress lately with her business. She's been working long hours, not eating regularly." None of that was true. My business was doing well, but it wasn't stressful. I ate regular meals, exercised regularly, and had just had a clean bill of health at my annual physical 3 months ago. But my brain was too foggy to form coherent protests. The blood work had shown elevated white cell counts and signs of some kind of toxin, though the doctors hadn't been able to identify exactly what. My liver enzymes were spiking, my kidney function was starting to decline, and my neurological responses were becoming sluggish. "We're going to admit her for observation," Dr. Mitchell had told Oscar while I drifted in and out of consciousness, on the gurney. These symptoms could indicate several different conditions, and we want to monitor her closely while we run more comprehensive tests. Oscar had been the perfect worried husband, holding my hand, asking all the right questions, insisting on staying by my bedside even when the nurses suggested he go home and get some rest. "I'm not leaving her," he'd said firmly. "She's my wife. My place is here." For the first day, I'd genuinely believed I was lucky to have such a devoted husband. Even through the haze of whatever was making me sick, I'd been touched by his constant presence, his gentle care, the way he'd handled all the logistics with the hospital and my insurance. It wasn't until the second day, when I'd started drifting, in and out of consciousness more frequently, that I'd overheard the first troubling conversation. Oscar talking quietly to someone on his phone about liquid assets and power of attorney paperwork. But it wasn't until this morning, the third day, that I'd heard the full scope of what was happening. The casual discussion of my impending death, the mention of previous wives in other cities, the revelation that my own doctor was part of whatever scheme Oscar was running. Lying here now, pretending to be unconscious while my mind raced with the implications, I realized the anniversary dinner hadn't been a celebration at all. It had been an execution, carefully planned and precisely timed to occur just days before my 35th birthday and the trust activation. Oscar hadn't just poisoned me. He'd choreographed my entire murder, down to the romantic setting and loving words that would be the last thing I'd remember of our marriage. The man I'd trusted with my heart, my home, and my financial security had turned our second anniversary into my death sentence. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed I would die quietly and quickly, like whatever had happened to Jane, Harriet, and his other victims. He hadn't counted on the Morrison family constitution. We were survivors, fighters, and we didn't go down without taking our enemies with us. The first sign that not everything was as it appeared came from an unexpected source. The night shift nurse who'd been assigned to my care. Her name was Jane, which sent a chill through me given what I'd overheard about Oscar's previous victim with the same name. But this Jane was very much alive, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands who seemed to genuinely care about her patients. It was during her second night caring for me that I noticed her watching Oscar with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not suspicion exactly, but something close to it. A wariness that suggested she'd seen something that didn't sit right with her professional instincts. I'd been drifting in that strange space between consciousness and sleep, aware enough to hear conversations but still too weak to respond meaningfully, when Jane had entered my room during one of Oscar's visits. He'd been sitting beside my bed, holding my hand and speaking in the low, concerned tones of a devoted husband. "The doctors still don't know what's causing her decline," he'd been saying, presumably into his phone. "They're running more tests, but her condition seems to be deteriorating faster than they expected." Jane had bustled around the room, checking my IV, adjusting monitors, performing the routine tasks that punctuated hospital days and nights. But I'd caught the way her eyes lingered on Oscar, the slight frown that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. After Oscar had left that night, Jane had approached my bedside with a gentleness that felt different from her usual professional manner. More personal, more concerned. "Mrs. Morrison," she'd said softly, using my maiden name instead of the Mrs. Hartwell that appeared on my hospital bracelet. "I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, I want you to know that something doesn't feel right about all this." The "by" use of my maiden name had jolted me more awake. I'd kept Morrison as my middle name after marrying Oscar, but it wasn't on any of my hospital paperwork. How did she know? "I've been a nurse for 28 years, Jane had continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen a lot of different kinds of poisoning cases, and your symptoms, they don't match what your husband and Dr. Mitchell are saying caused this." She'd paused, checking the doorway to make sure no one was approaching. "Your blood work shows signs of ricin exposure, honey. That's not something you get from food allergies or contaminated restaurant meals. That's something someone gives you, deliberately, Ricin. The word had echoed in my mind as I'd fought to keep my breathing steady and my heart rate from spiking on the monitors. The same poison Oscar had mentioned to Angel when they'd thought I was unconscious. "I can't prove anything yet," Jane had whispered. "But I've started documenting everything. Every conversation I overhear, every time your husband asks questions. About your medical status, every medication change Dr. Mitchell orders. If something happens to you, there needs to be a record." The knowledge that someone suspected what was happening should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with a new kind of terror. If Jane was getting suspicious, how long before Oscar or Angel noticed? How long before they decided she was a threat that needed to be eliminated? The next morning had brought a visit from Dr. Mitchell, accompanied by Oscar and a man I didn't recognize, tall, thin, with the kind of forgettable face that would blend into any crowd. They'd spoken in low voices at the foot of my bed, their words just audible enough for me to catch fragments, neurological damage progressing as expected. Dr. Mitchell had been saying, "Another 48 hours at most." "And the paperwork?" Oscar had asked. "All in order," the stranger had replied. "Power of attorney is filed, will is updated, insurance beneficiaries confirmed. When the time comes, everything will transfer smoothly." The casual efficiency of it had made my blood run cold. They weren't just planning my death. They were treating it like a business transaction, complete with documentation and legal procedures. But it was what happened after they'd left that had truly opened my eyes to the scope of what I was facing. Jane had returned during her shift change, and this time she hadn't been alone. With her was an older woman in plain clothes who moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. "This is Detective Susan Reeves," Jane had whispered, positioning herself to block the doorway view. "She specializes in financial crimes, and she's very interested in your case." Detective Reeves had approached my bedside with the careful manner of someone who understood that I might be able to hear more than my medical chart suggested. "Mrs. Morrison," she'd said, using my maiden name just as Jane had. "If you can understand me, I need you to know that we're aware of what's happening here." She'd paused, studying my face for any sign of recognition. "Your husband isn't who he claims to be. His real name is Oscar Finch, and he's wanted in connection with the suspicious deaths of at least 4 women in 3 different states over the past 5 years. 4 women. Not 3, as I'd overheard. There had been another victim somewhere, another woman who'd trusted the wrong man and paid for it with her life. We've been tracking him for 8 months, Detective Reeves had continued. But he's been careful. Always moves to a new city after each incident. Always establishes a legitimate business presence. Always marries women with substantial assets. But no close family to ask difficult questions. No close family. The phrase had hit me like a physical blow. It was true. My parents were dead, I was an only child, and most of my extended family lived on the East Coast. To an outside observer, I probably looked like the perfect victim. Wealthy, isolated, and trusting. "But you're different," Detective Reeves had said, as if reading my thoughts. "You come from a family with resources, with connections. People who've been looking out for Morrison interests for generations. When you didn't show up for your monthly check-in with your trust administrator, they got concerned. When they couldn't reach you by phone and your husband gave evasive answers, they called us, my trust administrator." I'd completely forgotten about the monthly calls with Darren Walsh, the family lawyer who'd been managing Morrison affairs since before I was born. It was just a routine check-in, usually lasting no more than 10 minutes, but I'd never missed. 1 in 15 years. "Mr. Walsh has been trying to reach you for a week," Detective Reeves had explained. "When your husband told him you were too sick to come to the phone, Mr. Walsh requested to speak with your doctors directly. That's when he discovered that your medical power of attorney had been filed just 2 days after you were admitted. Remarkably convenient timing." The pieces were starting to come together, revealing a picture that was both terrifying and oddly hopeful. Oscar might have planned this perfectly, but he'd underestimated the network of protection that surrounded the Morrison family. Even I had underestimated it. "We can't move openly yet," Detective Reeves had continued. "We need more evidence, and we need to ensure your safety. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. If you can hear me, if you're aware of what's happening, we need you to hang on just a little longer." She'd reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, no bigger than a button. "Jane is going to place this under your mattress. It's a transmitter that will allow us to monitor what's being said in this room. Every conversation, every plan they make, we'll have a record of it." The transmitter had been Jane's idea, Detective Reeves had explained. As a nurse, she had access to patients' rooms at all hours without raising suspicion. She could monitor my condition, document any changes in my treatment, and serve as the police department's eyes and ears inside the hospital. "Your husband thinks he's been clever," Detective Reeves had said as Jane had carefully positioned the device. "He's used the same playbook in 4 different cities, always staying just ahead of investigations, always leaving just enough doubt that local police couldn't build solid cases. But this time was different. This time he'd targeted someone with resources he hadn't anticipated, someone whose disappearance would trigger responses he hadn't planned for. The Morrison family might have been reduced to just me, but the infrastructure built around protecting Morrison interests remained intact. As Detective Reeves had prepared to leave, she'd leaned close to my ear. "Your 35th birthday is in 5 days," she'd whispered. "If you can stay alive until then, you'll have access to resources that will let you fight back. But more than that, you'll have the legal standing to authorize us to take action on your behalf." 5 days. It felt like a lifetime when every hour brought new symptoms, new evidence of whatever poison was working its way through my system. But it also felt like hope, the first real hope I'd had since this nightmare began. Oscar thought he was racing against time to complete his scheme before I died. What he didn't realize was that he was actually racing against the activation of the Morrison Family Trust and all the power and protection that came with it. The moment Detective Reeves left my room, something fundamental shifted inside me. It wasn't just the knowledge that help was coming, though that was enormous. It was the realization that I had been approaching this entire situation from the wrong perspective. I'd been thinking like a victim, helpless, poisoned, trapped in a hospital bed while my husband systematically destroyed my life. But I wasn't just any victim. I was Marianne Morrison, and the Morrison family hadn't built a $500 million empire by lying down when threatened. My great-grandfather, William Morrison, had started with a single shipping vessel in 1903. By the time he died in 1954, Morrison Shipping controlled trade routes throughout the Pacific Northwest and held contracts with companies across 3 countries. He'd survived the 1906 earthquake, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless attempts by competitors to destroy his business. The family stories I'd grown up hearing weren't just tales of business success. They were lessons in survival, in fighting back, in never letting anyone take what was rightfully yours. My grandfather, Robert Morrison Sr., had been equally formidable. When a group of corrupt city officials had tried to force Morrison Shipping out of the Seattle harbor through discriminatory regulations in the 1960s, he hadn't just fought them in court. He'd systematically exposed their corruption, ending 3 political careers and sending 2 men to prison. The Morrison family had a long tradition of turning the tables on those who underestimated them, and my father, Robert Jr., had carried on that tradition in his own way. As a corporate lawyer specializing in white-collar crime, he'd made a career of protecting clients from exactly the kind of financial predators that Oscar represented. He'd taught me from childhood that the best defense against fraud was understanding how fraudsters operated, knowing their weaknesses, and being prepared to use every legal weapon available. The moment someone targets a Morrison, my father had told me once, they've made the biggest mistake of their lives. We don't just fight back. We make sure they can never hurt anyone else again. Lying in that hospital bed, pretending to be dying while my husband planned my funeral, I finally understood what he'd meant. This wasn't just about my survival anymore. This was about justice for Jane in Denver, for Harriet in Portland, for Cooper's widow in Phoenix, and for whoever the fourth victim had been. This was about stopping Oscar before he could find his next target. But first, I needed to survive long, enough to access the resources that would make that possible. The ricin in my system was real. I could feel it working its way through my organs, making me weaker by the hour. Dr. Mitchell's timeline might have been part of the murder plot, but the medical reality was that I was dying, slowly but surely. The thought triggered a memory from my childhood, a story my grandmother had told me about my great-great-grandfather, Marcus Morrison, who'd survived a poisoning attempt by business rivals in 1889. Family legend said he'd saved himself by eating activated charcoal and forcing himself to vomit repeatedly, expelling the poison before it could kill him. The story had always seemed like frontier folklore, but now I wondered if there might be medical truth behind it. I needed to find a way to communicate with Jane without alerting Oscar or Dr. Mitchell. More than that, I needed to find a way to counteract whatever poison was killing me, or at least slow its effects until my birthday triggered the trust activation. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, during the shift change, Jane had entered my room alone to check my vitals. As she leaned over to adjust my IV, I managed the smallest possible movement, a barely perceptible squeeze of her hand. She'd frozen, her eyes searching. My face. "Can you hear me?" she'd whispered, so quietly that even I could barely make out the words. Another tiny squeeze. "Oh, thank God," she'd breathed. "We've been so worried. Can you stay conscious? Can you communicate?" I'd managed the tiniest nod, just a slight movement of my head that could have been mistaken for an involuntary reflex if anyone else had been watching. Jane had immediately positioned herself to block the view from the doorway. "Listen carefully," she'd whispered. "Detective Reeves wants you to know that they've identified the poison. It's ricin, administered in a delayed-release form that's been keeping you sick for days instead of killing you immediately. The good news is that ricin poisoning can be treated if caught early enough. Delayed-release ricin. That explained why I was dying slowly instead of quickly, why Oscar had been confident about his timeline. He'd given me a sophisticated poison. That would take days to kill me, giving him time to complete his financial preparations while maintaining plausible deniability about the cause. Dr. Mitchell has been preventing the other doctors from administering the correct treatment, Jane had continued. But I've been documenting everything, and Detective Reeves has been working with the hospital administration. Tomorrow morning, there's going to be a shift in your care team. A shift in my care team meant Dr. Mitchell would be removed from my case. It meant I might actually receive proper medical treatment instead of whatever cocktail of drugs had been keeping me compliant and dying on schedule. "But there's something else you need to know," Jane had said, her voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Detective Reeves discovered that your husband has been in contact with someone about moving up his timeline. They think he's getting nervous about the police attention, moving up his timeline. That could only mean one thing. Oscar was planning to accelerate my death, possibly as soon as tonight. If you can manage it," Jane had whispered, "we need you to try to stay awake. Try to be alert. If anything happens, if anyone tries to give you medication or do anything unusual, you need to resist as much as you can." Resist. It seemed like an impossible request given how weak I felt, but I understood what she was asking. If Oscar or Dr. Mitchell tried to give me a fatal dose of something, I needed to fight back, even if it was just enough to create a disturbance that would bring help. After Jane had left, I'd spent the evening practicing small movements, testing what my body could still do. Flexing my fingers under the blanket, moving my toes inside the hospital socks, turning my head slightly from side to side. All movements so small they wouldn't register on the monitors, but enough to prove to myself that I wasn't completely helpless. The night brought exactly what Jane had warned me about. Around 2 a.m., Dr. Mitchell had entered my room with a syringe and a medication vial I didn't recognize. He'd moved quietly, checking the hallway before closing the door behind him. "Time to end this charade," he'd muttered, preparing to inject whatever was in the syringe directly into my IV line. But I was ready for him. The moment the needle touched my IV port, I'd managed to jerk my arm just enough to dislodge it, sending the syringe clattering to the floor. The movement had triggered alarms on my monitors, bringing Jane running into the room within seconds. "What's happening here?" she'd demanded, taking in the scene. Dr. Mitchell standing over my bed with a broken syringe at his feet, my heart rate spiking on the monitors. "Patient became agitated," Dr. Mitchell had said smoothly. I was administering a sedative to calm her down, but Jane had been too experienced to buy the lie. "That syringe contains potassium chloride," she'd said, having obviously read the label on the broken vial. "That's not a sedative. That's a cardiac arrest drug. At this dosage, it would have killed her in minutes." The confrontation that followed had brought hospital security, then police, then Detective Reeves herself. Dr. Mitchell had been arrested on the spot, his attempts to murder me having been caught in the act by a witness who could testify to exactly what had happened. But more importantly, his arrest had triggered the medical intervention I desperately needed. A new doctor, Dr. Sarah Chen, had immediately begun treating me for ricin poisoning with the proper protocols. Activated charcoal, IV fluids to flush my system, medications to protect my organs from further damage. "You're going to make it, Dr. Chen had told me as the treatment began. "It's going to be touch and go for the next 24 hours. But if we can get your body to start processing this poison out of your system, you should recover completely." 24 hours. That would bring me to my 35th birthday, to the moment when the Morrison Family Trust would activate, and I would legally control resources that Oscar couldn't even imagine. As the medicine began to work its way through my system, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days: hope. Not just for survival, but for justice. Oscar thought he'd planned the perfect crime, but he'd made one crucial error in judgment. He'd targeted a Morrison, and Morrisons always fought back. The arrest of Dr. Mitchell sent shockwaves through Oscar's carefully constructed plan, but he was far from finished. Within hours of his accomplice's detention, Oscar had shifted into damage control mode, and I could see the predator's true cunning for the first time. Instead of panicking or fleeing, he doubled down on his grieving husband act, using Dr. Mitchell's arrest as proof of how dedicated he was to finding the real cause of my mysterious illness. "I knew something wasn't right," Oscar told Detective Reeves when she interviewed him the next morning, his voice perfectly calibrated with righteous anger and concern. "Dr. Mitchell kept saying Marianne's condition was hopeless, that we should just make her comfortable. But I insisted they keep trying. I demanded second opinions. I think he was trying to cover up his own malpractice by letting her die. It was a masterful performance, one that might have worked if Detective Reeves hadn't already known exactly who she was dealing with. But watching him through barely opened eyes as he spun his lies, I finally understood how he'd evaded justice for so long. Oscar wasn't just a killer, he was a consummate actor, capable of becoming whatever character the situation required. The new medical team treating me had begun to turn the tide against the ricin poisoning, but recovery was slow and painful. Dr. Chen had explained that while the proper treatment could neutralize the remaining poison, my organs had already sustained significant damage. My liver and kidneys were working overtime to process the toxins, and my nervous system would take weeks to fully recover. But the improvement was noticeable. By the second day under proper care, I could stay conscious for longer periods and maintain better control over my movements. More importantly, I could think clearly for the first time since the anniversary dinner, and my mind was racing with everything I'd learned. Jane had become my lifeline to the outside world, smuggling information to me during her shifts and serving as my link to Detective Reeves's investigation. Through her, I learned that the police had been building a case against Oscar for months, tracking his movements across multiple states and connecting him to the suspicious deaths of his previous victims. They have bank records showing large withdrawals from each victim's accounts shortly before their deaths, Jane whispered during one of our covert conversations. Credit card charges that put him in the right locations at the right times, phone records connecting him to Dr. Mitchell and others in his network. The network was what truly chilled me. Oscar hadn't been working alone. He was part of an organized group that specialized in targeting wealthy women, with contacts in hospitals, law firms, and financial institutions across the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Mitchell was just one piece of a larger machine designed to separate vulnerable people from their money. Angel Winters is his primary partner, Jane continued. She's the one who scouts potential targets, handles the financial transfers, and maintains the false identities they use. The police think she's the mastermind behind the whole operation. Angel Winters. Now I had a full name for the woman whose voice I'd heard discussing my murder. According to Detective Reeves's intelligence, Angel had been operating similar schemes for over a decade, with Oscar being her most recent and most successful recruit. But the most disturbing revelation came when Jane shared what the police had discovered about Oscar's real background. His name wasn't even Oscar Hartwell. It was Owen Finch, and he had a criminal history dating back 15 years. Fraud convictions. In California, suspected involvement in several unexplained deaths in Oregon, and a pattern of targeting women who fit a very specific profile. Wealthy, professional, recently deceased parents, limited family connections, Jane recited the profile quietly. Women who had significant assets but wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. You were perfect for their scheme, except for one thing they didn't research thoroughly enough. The Morrison Family Trust. It was the one element of my background that Oscar and Angel had completely missed in their targeting research. To them, I'd looked like a successful graphic designer with a modest inheritance, exactly the kind of victim who would have enough money to make the scheme worthwhile, but not enough connections to create problems. They'd had no idea that my modest inheritance was just the tip of an iceberg that included one of the largest private trusts in the Pacific Northwest. But now, I faced a new problem. My 35th birthday was tomorrow, and while I was recovering from the poisoning, I was still far from being able to physically confront Oscar or take control of the situation myself. I needed allies, and I needed them to act on my behalf until I was strong enough to take charge personally. That's when Jane brought me the most unexpected news of all. "Detective Reeves wants to introduce you to someone," she said during her evening shift. "Someone who's been working behind the scenes to protect you, even before the police got involved." The someone turned out to be Darren Walsh, the Morrison family attorney I'd been supposed to check in with weekly. He arrived at the hospital that night accompanied by Detective Reeves and a man I didn't recognize but who carried himself with the quiet authority of serious money. "Mary Ann," Darren said, his familiar voice bringing tears to my eyes. "Thank God you're all right. When you missed our call last week, I knew something was wrong immediately." Darren had known me since I was a child, had helped my parents structure my inheritance and prepare for the trust activation. He was more than just a family lawyer. He was one of the few people who truly understood the full scope of Morrison family resources and how to deploy them when needed. "This is Harrison Cooper," Darren continued, introducing the other man. "He's been the trust administrator for the past 20 years, and he's the one who authorized the investigation when we couldn't reach you." Harrison Cooper looked like exactly what he was, a man who managed vast sums of money for people who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Conservative suit, careful manner, and eyes that missed nothing. But when he spoke, there was warmth in his voice that suggested he took his responsibilities personally. "Miss Morrison," he said, using the formal address that reminded me of my family's legacy. "I want you to know that every resource of the Morrison Trust has been at Detective Reeves's disposal since we identified the threat against you. We've been working together to ensure not only your safety, but your ability to seek justice once you recover." The resources of the Morrison Trust. I'd never really understood what that meant before, but now I was beginning to grasp the reality. It wasn't just money. It was access, influence, connections built over more than a century of protecting Morrison family interests. We've already begun taking defensive measures, Harrison explained. All of your personal accounts have been frozen to prevent further theft. Your husband's access to any Morrison-related assets has been revoked, and we've hired a private security firm to ensure your safety once you're discharged from the hospital. But the most important revelation came next. Tomorrow, when you turn 35, you'll have full access to trust resources, Harrison said. That includes not just the principal amount, but the legal team, the investigative services, and the financial networks that have been built to protect Morrison interests. Detective Reeves leaned forward. What we're asking is whether you want to press charges against your husband for attempted murder and theft, or whether you want us to step back and let you handle this through private channels. Private channels. The phrase carried implications that both thrilled and terrified me. The Morrison family had always preferred to handle their problems quietly, efficiently, and with results that ensured the problems never occurred again. I want him stopped, I managed to say, my voice still weak but filled with determination. Not just arrested, stopped completely. I want justice for me and for every woman he's killed. Harrison nodded approvingly. Then we'll coordinate with Detective Reeves to build a case that will not only put your husband and his accomplices in prison, but will also recover every penny they've stolen and ensure they can never hurt anyone else. As the three of them left my room, I felt a shift in the balance of power that had been tipped against me for so long. Tomorrow, I would legally control resources that Oscar couldn't even imagine. But more than that, I would have the backing of an organization that had been protecting Morrison interests for over a century. Oscar thought he'd targeted a vulnerable woman with a modest inheritance. Instead, he'd declared war on one of the most powerful families in the Pacific Northwest. And tomorrow, when the trust activated, I would have the weapons to fight back. My 35th birthday arrived not with celebration, but with revelations. That made everything I thought I knew about Oscar's scheme seem small and simple by comparison. At exactly midnight, the Morrison Family Trust activated, transferring legal control of $500 million to me. But with that power came access to information that revealed the true scope of what I was fighting. Harrison Cooper arrived at dawn with a briefcase full of documents and a grim expression that told me the news wasn't good. Detective Reeves accompanied him, along with a woman I didn't recognize. Tall, sharp-featured, with the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding authority. This is Agent Patricia Vance from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, Detective Reeves explained as they settled around my hospital bed. What we've uncovered goes far beyond your husband's individual crimes. Agent Vance opened a tablet and turned it toward me, showing photographs of women I'd never seen before. Young faces, older faces, all smiling in what looked like wedding. Photos or social media pictures. We've identified 7 confirmed victims over the past 8 years, she said. Your husband and Angel Winters are part of what we call a Black Widow network, organized groups that specifically target wealthy individuals for systematic financial exploitation and murder. 7 victims, not the 3 or 4 I'd heard mentioned, but 7 women who'd trusted the wrong person and paid with their lives. Each photograph represented someone's daughter, sister, maybe mother, all reduced to case files and evidence photos. The network operates across multiple states, Agent Vance continued. They have contacts in hospitals, law firms, banks, and even social services. It's not just opportunistic crime, it's a sophisticated operation with infrastructure, protocols, and what appears to be significant financial backing. Harrison leaned forward, his usually calm demeanor showing cracks of anger. Marianne, they didn't just target you randomly. The Morrison Trust has been under surveillance for months, possibly years. They knew exactly when you'd turn 35, exactly what resources would become available to you. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My courtship with Oscar hadn't been a chance meeting at a wedding. It had been a calculated campaign planned months in advance. Every romantic gesture, every shared moment, every declaration of love had been choreographed with one goal: position him to steal $500 million. How long? I managed to ask, my voice still weak but filled with rage. We found evidence that they began researching you 18 months before you met, Detective Reeves replied. Phone records show calls between Angel Winters and someone at your friend's wedding venue. We think they may have influenced the guest list to ensure Oscar would be there when you were. 18 months of planning. They'd studied my routines, my relationships, my vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of military intelligence. The wedding where we'd met, the friends who'd introduced us, even the circumstances that had made me open to a new relationship. All of it potentially orchestrated. But there's something else, Agent Vance said, her tone becoming even more serious. We believe the Morrison Trust itself was the ultimate target, not just your personal assets. The timing of your poisoning wasn't just about preventing the trust activation. It was about triggering a specific succession clause. Harrison nodded grimly. If you had died before your 35th birthday without direct heirs, the trust would have been dissolved and the assets distributed to various charities and distant relatives. But there's a provision that allows for asset recovery if fraud is proven within 90 days of dissolution. They weren't planning to just steal your money and disappear, Detective Reeves explained. They were planning to let the trust dissolve legally, then use forged documents and corrupted legal proceedings to claim a significant portion of those distributed assets. With contacts in multiple law firms and financial institutions, they could have potentially recovered $50 to $100 million through fraudulent inheritance claims. The sophistication of it was breathtaking. They hadn't just been planning to kill me. They'd been planning to systematically loot one of the oldest family trusts in the Pacific Northwest, using my death as the key to unlock resources that had been protected for over a century. How many others are involved? I asked. We're still uncovering the network, Agent Vance replied, but we've identified at least 12 individuals in 5 states, including lawyers, doctors, bank employees, and what appear to be professional identity forgers. This isn't a small-time con operation. It's organized crime on a scale that requires significant coordination and funding. The revelation that overwhelmed everything else came next. Harrison pulled out a thick folder and set it on the bed beside me. Marianne, there's something about your parents' death that you need to know. My parents had died 7 years ago in what had been ruled a single-car accident on a mountain highway. Dad had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel during a late-night drive home from a business trip, causing their car to go off the road. It had been tragic but not suspicious. He'd been working long hours, and the weather had been poor. We've reopened the investigation into their accident, Agent Vance said gently. The timing bothers us. They died just 2 months after you'd graduated from college and started your design business. If they'd lived another 3 years, they would have been present when you turned 35 and the trust activated. The wow. Folder contained photographs of the accident scene, police reports, and medical examiner findings I'd never seen before. But it also contained new evidence, analysis of the car's mechanical systems, toxicology reports that hadn't been in the original investigation, and witness statements that raised questions about the official conclusion. Your father's blood. Work showed traces of a sedative that wasn't prescribed to him, Detective Reeves explained. The car's brake lines had been recently tampered with, and there were tire tracks at the scene that didn't match your parents' vehicle. The room seemed to spin around me. My parents hadn't died in an accident. They'd been murdered, killed by the same network that had spent years planning my own death, eliminating the people who would have been most likely to protect me when I became vulnerable. We think they've been planning this for nearly a decade, Agent Vance said quietly. Your parents' death was phase 1, removing your primary protection and support system. Your marriage to Oscar was phase 2, gaining access to your immediate resources and positioning for the final strike. And your poisoning was phase 3, eliminating you just before the trust activation while maximizing their ability to loot the dissolved assets. 10 years of planning, 10 years of surveillance, manipulation, and murder, all focused on stealing the Morrison family fortune. They'd killed my parents, isolated me, manipulated me into a fraudulent marriage, and nearly succeeded in completing their scheme. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that the Morrison Trust was just money, that controlling the financial assets was the same as controlling the Morrison legacy. They had no idea that the trust came with resources, connections, and capabilities that had been built over more than a century of protecting Morrison interests. Now I had access to all of it. And I was going to use every resource at my disposal to destroy them completely. The knowledge that my parents had been murdered transformed my recovery from a personal battle into something much larger. I wasn't just fighting for my own life anymore. I was fighting to avenge my family and protect other potential victims. But to wage that kind of war, I needed allies who understood the stakes and had the skills to match the sophistication of the network we were facing. Harrison Cooper proved to be the first piece of that puzzle. As the Morrison Trust Administrator, he had access to resources I'd never fully understood. The trust wasn't just an investment portfolio. It was a comprehensive support system that included legal teams, security firms, private investigators, and financial analysts who'd been protecting Morrison interests for generations. The trust employs 47 people full-time, Harrison explained as my strength continued to improve. Lawyers, accountants, security specialists, even former FBI agents who handle sensitive investigations. Your great-grandfather built this infrastructure because he understood that real wealth requires real protection. Within hours of the trust activation, Harrison had assembled what he called the Morrison Response Team, specialists who'd been on retainer for years, but had never been needed for something this serious. They began arriving at the hospital throughout the day, each bringing unique expertise to the growing operation. The first to arrive was Cooper Hayes, a former Navy SEAL who'd been providing security consulting for the trust for over a decade. Tall, methodical, and with eyes that seemed to catalog every potential threat in a room, Cooper immediately began assessing the security vulnerabilities that had allowed Oscar's network to get so close to me. "They've been surveilling you for years," Cooper explained, showing me photographs taken from traffic cameras and security footage. "Your apartment building, your office, even your regular coffee shop. They had people watching your movements, learning your patterns, identifying opportunities." The photographs were chilling. Images of Angel Winters sitting in a car outside my design studio, of unknown men following me through Pike Place Market, of Oscar himself meeting with suspicious individuals weeks before our supposed chance encounter at the wedding. "But surveillance works both ways," Cooper added with a grim smile. "Now that we know who they are, we can watch them." The second ally was Dr. Harriet Lawson, a toxicologist who specialized in criminal poisoning cases. Small, fierce, and with an encyclopedic knowledge of every poison known to medical science, Dr. Lawson took one look at my blood work and immediately understood the full scope of what had been done to me. "Delayed-release ricin delivered through a food vehicle," she diagnosed. "Sophisticated, expensive, and requiring significant chemical knowledge to produce. This wasn't mixed up in someone's kitchen. It came from a professional laboratory." Dr. Lawson's analysis revealed that the poison had been specifically calibrated to my body weight and metabolism, ensuring that I would die slowly enough for Oscar to complete his financial preparations, but quickly enough to prevent medical intervention. The level of personalization was disturbing. They'd studied me thoroughly enough to calculate exactly how much poison would kill me and how long it would take. "But here's what they didn't account for," Dr. Lawson continued. "The Morrison family has a genetic resistance to certain toxins. It's documented in your family medical history going back 4 generations. What should have killed you in 3 days has taken nearly a week, and that extra time is what saved your life." Even my genetics had been working against Oscar's plan. The Morrison family's biological resilience, developed over generations of surviving various attempts on their lives and fortunes, had given me the extra time I needed for help to arrive. The third ally surprised me. Jane Martinez, the nurse who'd been documenting everything, wasn't just a dedicated healthcare professional. She was also a former police detective who'd left law enforcement to pursue nursing after being injured in the line of duty. I knew something was wrong from the first night, Jane explained. Your husband's behavior didn't match what I'd seen from genuine grieving spouses. Too controlled, too prepared, too focused on financial logistics instead of medical possibilities. Jane had been conducting her own investigation parallel to the official police work, using her medical access to gather evidence that law enforcement couldn't obtain easily. She'd documented every conversation, photographed every suspicious document, and maintained detailed logs of everyone who'd entered my room. I've seen this pattern before, Jane said, showing me her notes. During my detective years, I worked several cases involving medical fraud and insurance scams. The way your husband interacted with the staff, the questions he asked about your prognosis, the timing of his financial inquiries. It all pointed to someone who was planning for a specific outcome. The fourth ally was the most unexpected. Agent Vance introduced her as Special Agent Darren Kim, a federal prosecutor who'd been tracking the Black Widow network for over 3 years. Young, intense, and with a personal stake in the case that became clear when he explained his background. My sister was one of their earlier victims, Agent Kim revealed. 3 years ago in Portland. They called her death a suicide, but I never believed it. She'd just inherited money from our grandmother, and she'd been acting strangely in the weeks before she died, talking about her new boyfriend, making changes to her will. Agent Kim's sister had been Harriet, the Portland victim whose name I'd heard Oscar mention. The revelation created a bond between us that went beyond professional necessity. We'd both lost family members to the same network, and we both understood that this was about more than just legal justice. I've been building a federal case against them for years, Agent Kim continued. But they've been careful, moving between jurisdictions, using different identities, staying just ahead of investigations. Your case is the first time we've caught them in the act with enough evidence to bring them down completely. The final ally was perhaps the most crucial. Owen Fletcher, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing hidden assets and complex financial crimes. Quiet, methodical, and with an almost supernatural ability to follow money trails through the most convoluted schemes, Owen had been analyzing the network's financial operations for months. They've stolen over $40 million in the past 8 years, Owen reported. But they've also spent significant money on infrastructure, paying off accomplices, and maintaining their operations. The good news is that most of their assets are still traceable and recoverable. Owen's analysis revealed that the network had grown overconfident, keeping detailed financial records that would ultimately become evidence against them. They'd assumed their victims would be dead, and their crimes would never be investigated thoroughly enough to uncover the full scope of their operations. We can not only recover your stolen funds, Owen promised, but we can also seize their entire operation and recover assets stolen from other victims. With the right legal strategy, we can shut them down completely and ensure they never hurt anyone else. As I looked around the room at this team of specialists, each bringing unique skills and personal motivation to the fight, I realized that Oscar had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd seen the Morrison Trust as just money to be stolen, but it was actually a weapon system that had been built over generations to protect against exactly this kind of threat. The hunters had become the hunted, and we were going to destroy them completely. With my team assembled, we began the methodical work of building an airtight case while simultaneously preparing for what Owen Fletcher called comprehensive asset recovery, a polite term for systematically dismantling every financial resource the network had accumulated through their crimes. The Morrison Trust's resources allowed us to work with a thoroughness that normal law enforcement couldn't match. Cooper Hayes established our security perimeter first. Within 24 hours of being assigned to my case, he'd identified 3 separate surveillance teams that had been monitoring the hospital, tracking who visited me and when. Instead of confronting them directly, Cooper implemented what he called counter-surveillance protocol. "We're going to let them watch," Cooper explained, showing me feeds from cameras his team had installed around the hospital. "But we're going to control what they see. Every piece of information they gather will be information we want them to have." The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. We created a false narrative for Oscar and Angel's surveillance teams to observe. One where I was recovering slowly, where my medical team was pessimistic about my cognitive function, and where my new legal team was struggling to understand the complexities of the Morrison Trust. They would see meetings with lawyers who appeared confused, medical consultations that suggested lasting brain damage, and financial discussions that implied the trust activation had been delayed due to my incapacity. Meanwhile, the real work happened in secure locations away from their observation. Harrison Cooper had arranged for us to use a conference room in a downtown Seattle law firm that specialized in high-stakes corporate litigation. The room was soundproof, electronically secured, and accessible through private entrances that allowed our team to meet without being detected. Dr. Harriet Lawson's toxicology analysis became the foundation of our criminal case. Working with samples of my blood and tissue that had been preserved throughout my hospitalization, she was able to not only identify the specific type of ricin used, but also trace its likely origin. "This is military-grade ricin," Dr. Lawson explained, during one of our secure meetings. "The purification process requires sophisticated equipment and extensive chemical knowledge. There are maybe a dozen laboratories in North America capable of producing ricin of this quality." More importantly, she'd found traces of a rare stabilizing compound that was used by only 3 laboratories, all of which kept detailed records of their chemical purchases and production schedules. It would be possible to trace the specific batch of ricin used to poison me, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence linking Oscar to my attempted murder. Owen Fletcher's financial investigation revealed the true scope of the network's operations. Working with access to banking systems that the Morrison Trust's legal team had secured through court orders, Owen had traced money flows across dozens of accounts in multiple countries. "They're not just killing for individual inheritances," Owen reported. "They're operating what amounts to a financial harvesting operation. They identify wealthy targets, eliminate them systematically, and then use corrupted legal processes to claim portions of their estates." The financial analysis showed that the network had been operating for over a decade, with Angel Winters serving as the central coordinator for operations across the western United States. Oscar was just one of several operatives who specialized in the seduction and elimination phase of their schemes. "But here's the critical weakness in their system," Owen continued. "They've been reinvesting their profits into expanding their operations. Most of their stolen money is tied up in properties, equipment, and payments to accomplices. If we can freeze their assets quickly enough, we can prevent them from liquidating everything and disappearing." Agent Darren Kim's federal investigation had uncovered the network's organizational structure. Working with FBI resources and the evidence we'd provided, he'd identified the hierarchy that allowed them to operate across state lines without detection. "Angel Winters is the CEO," Agent Kim explained, showing us an organizational chart that looked like something from a Fortune 500 company. "She handles strategic planning, target selection, and resource allocation. Under her are regional coordinators, who manage operations in specific geographic areas. And under them are the operatives like your husband who handle direct victim contact." The network employed over 30 people full-time, with additional part-time accomplices in hospitals, law, firms, banks, and government offices across 5 states. They had backup identities prepared, escape routes planned, and contingency funds hidden in offshore accounts. But they've never faced coordinated opposition before, Agent Kim noted. Their previous victims were isolated individuals with limited resources. They've built their entire operation around the assumption that their crimes would never be thoroughly investigated. Jane Martinez's medical documentation had become crucial evidence for the criminal case. Her detailed logs proved that Dr. Mitchell had been systematically preventing proper medical treatment while providing false information about my condition to other hospital staff. Every conversation is recorded, Jane explained, showing us transcripts of interactions between Dr. Mitchell and Oscar. Every medication change is documented. Every false medical report is preserved with timestamps and witness verification. But Jane had gone beyond just documenting the medical conspiracy. Using her background as a former detective, she'd been conducting interviews with other hospital staff, identifying additional accomplices, and gathering evidence of similar cases that might have been mishandled in the past. We found 3 other suspicious deaths at this hospital over the past 2 years, Jane reported, all involving patients with significant assets, all with Dr. Mitchell as the attending physician, and all with similar patterns of family members asking detailed questions about financial matters instead of medical concerns. Special Agent Patricia Vance had been coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to track the network's global connections. The sophistication of their money laundering operations suggested partnerships with criminal organizations in multiple countries. They're not just stealing from individuals, Agent Vance explained. They're part of a larger network that specializes in high-value financial crimes. Our international partners have identified similar operations in Canada, the UK, and Australia, all with connections to the same offshore banking systems that your husband's network has been using. As our investigation deepened, it became clear that we weren't just dealing with a few criminals who'd gotten lucky. We were facing a professional organization that had been operating successfully for years, with resources, connections, and capabilities that matched those of legitimate businesses. But they'd made one fatal error in targeting me. They'd assumed that the Morrison Trust was just another wealthy family's money, not understanding that it came with infrastructure and resources that had been built specifically to protect against threats like theirs. Now we had everything we needed to destroy them completely. The question was no longer whether we could stop them, but how completely we could dismantle their entire operation and ensure they could never hurt anyone else again. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Mitchell himself. 3 days into his detention, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, he made the decision that would expose the full scope of the network we were fighting. He wants to make a deal, Agent Kim informed me during one of our secure meetings. Full disclosure about the network's operations in exchange for reduced charges and witness protection. Dr. Mitchell's cooperation revealed that what we'd been calling a Black Widow network was actually just one division of a much larger criminal organization. They called themselves the Heritage Group, and they specialized in what their leadership termed legacy liquidation, the systematic targeting and elimination of wealthy families to steal their accumulated assets. We've been looking at this. All wrong, Agent Vance explained as she spread out organizational charts that Dr. Mitchell had helped create. Angel Winters isn't the top of the hierarchy, she's middle management. The Heritage Group has been operating for over 15 years, with cells in 12 states and international connections in 6 countries. The revelation was staggering. The organization employed over 200 people full-time, including lawyers, doctors, financial advisors, identity forgers, and what Dr. Mitchell called elimination specialists, professional killers who specialized in making murders look like accidents or natural deaths. Dr. Mitchell's confession revealed that the Heritage Group had been responsible for at least 43 deaths over the past decade, stealing an estimated $250 million through their operations. They maintained detailed files on wealthy families across the country, tracking inheritance patterns, family relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. Your family has been in their files for over 20 years, Dr. Mitchell revealed during his debriefing session, which I attended via secure video link from my hospital room. They've been waiting for the right opportunity to target the Morrison Trust since the 1990s. The Morrison family's profile in their files was extensive, hundreds of pages documenting our financial holdings, family relationships, business connections, and personal habits going back generations. They'd identified my parents' deaths as their opening and had spent years positioning assets and personnel to exploit that vulnerability. The plan was never just to steal your inheritance, Dr. Mitchell continued. They wanted to completely eliminate the Morrison bloodline and then use corrupted legal processes to claim the entire trust through fabricated genealogical connections. The Heritage Group had been planning to install fake Morrison relatives, complete with forged birth certificates and manufactured family histories, who would claim inheritance rights after my death. They'd already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars creating false identities and bribing officials in multiple states to establish legal precedents for their fake relatives. But the scope of their current operations was even more disturbing. Agent Kim's team had identified 7 other wealthy individuals who were currently being targeted by different cells of the Heritage Group. We weren't just fighting for justice for past victims. We were racing to prevent ongoing murders. There's a woman in Portland who married one of their operatives 6 months ago, Agent Kim reported. A businessman in Vancouver whose new financial advisor is one of their accomplices. An elderly man in San Francisco whose caregiver is systematically poisoning him. We have active operations happening right now. The Morrison Trust's resources allowed us to do something that normal law enforcement couldn't. Mount simultaneous protective operations for all the potential victims while building cases against their attackers. Harrison Cooper authorized the expenditure of whatever funds were necessary to save lives and gather evidence. Cooper Hayes coordinated security teams for each potential victim, while Owen Fletcher began tracing the financial connections between all the Heritage Group operations. The pattern that emerged was both sophisticated and chilling. They'd been treating wealthy families like renewable resources, harvesting assets systematically while avoiding detection through careful geographic distribution and timing. They never hit the same city twice in consecutive years, Owen explained. They rotate between regions, vary their methods, and maintain legitimate business fronts in each location. It's corporate-level planning applied to serial murder. The Heritage Group's financial operations were equally sophisticated. They maintained a complex network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate investments that made their stolen money nearly impossible to trace through traditional law enforcement methods. But they made one crucial mistake, Owen continued with satisfaction. They've been using the same core accounting system for all their operations. Once we cracked the encryption on their financial records, we could see everything. Every theft, every payoff, every operational expense. The financial analysis revealed that the Heritage Group had been operating like a legitimate business, complete with annual budgets, performance metrics, and profit-sharing arrangements for their key personnel. They'd stolen over $400 million in the past 15 years, but they'd also spent heavily on infrastructure, personnel, and operational security. Most of their assets are still recoverable, Owen reported. They've been reinvesting their profits into expanding their operations instead of hiding the money offshore. If we can coordinate seizure operations properly, we can recover funds for dozens of victims' families. Dr. Mitchell's cooperation also revealed the Heritage Group's immediate plans for dealing with the exposure of their Seattle operation. They weren't planning to abandon their scheme, they were planning to accelerate it. There are kill orders out on everyone involved in exposing them, Dr. Mitchell warned. You, Detective Reeves, the nurse who's been documenting everything, even me. They can't afford to let this investigation continue. The Heritage Group's response team was already mobilizing, with elimination specialists being deployed to Seattle to clean up what they considered a compromised operation. But they were also moving to liquidate their assets and eliminate their current targets before law enforcement could intervene. We have maybe 72 hours before they start killing people, Agent Vance calculated. If we're going to stop them, we need to move simultaneously against all their operations. The scope of what we were planning was unprecedented. Coordinated law enforcement operations in 8 cities, financial seizures across multiple countries, and protective custody for dozens of potential witnesses and victims. It would require resources and coordination that exceeded normal FBI capabilities. But the Morrison Trust had been built for exactly this kind of challenge. Harrison Cooper began making calls to contacts in law enforcement, finance, and government that the Morrison family had cultivated over generations. Within hours, he'd secured cooperation from agencies and institutions across the country. Your great-grandfather understood that real wealth meant real responsibility, Harrison told me as the final preparations began. The Morrison Trust wasn't just built to preserve money. It was built to protect people and ensure that justice could be served when the normal systems weren't adequate. We had identified the full scope of our enemy, understood their capabilities and weaknesses, and assembled the resources necessary to destroy them completely. But we also knew that they were preparing to fight back with everything they had. The final battle was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Not just my life or my family's legacy, but the lives of current victims and the Heritage Group's ability to continue their operations. We had one chance to end this permanently. The war room Harrison Cooper established in the Morrison Trust's downtown Seattle offices looked like something from a military command center. Multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence on Heritage Group operations across 8 cities. Financial tracking systems monitored money movements across dozens of accounts, and secure communication lines connected us to law enforcement agencies in 4 countries. I was finally strong enough to leave the hospital, though I still needed a wheelchair for longer distances and constant medical monitoring. Dr. Chen had cleared me for limited activity, understanding that my involvement in the planning was crucial for both the operation's success and my psychological recovery. This is the most complex coordinated operation the FBI has attempted in a financial crimes case, Agent Vance explained as she outlined the scope of what we were planning. We're simultaneously targeting operational cells in Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, San Francisco, Denver, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Miami. Each cell has between 8 and 15 members, and they're all connected through encrypted communication systems and shared financial resources. The challenge wasn't just the geographic scope, it was the timing. The Heritage Group had protocols for exactly this situation, emergency procedures designed to allow them to liquidate assets and eliminate evidence within hours of detecting law enforcement attention. Our window for successful intervention was narrowing rapidly. They've already begun moving money, Owen Fletcher reported from his position at a bank of computer monitors tracking financial transactions. Large transfers started 6 hours ago. They're liquidating properties, emptying accounts, and converting assets to cryptocurrency and bearer bonds. But Owen had been prepared for this. Working with international banking authorities that Harrison had contacted through Morrison Trust connections, he'd arranged for what he called financial interdiction, a coordinated freezing of accounts, and assets that would prevent the Heritage Group from accessing their resources. We can't stop all the transfers, Owen explained, but we can trap most of their operational funds. They'll have enough cash for immediate expenses, but not enough to disappear permanently or fund new operations. Cooper Hayes had been coordinating with federal agencies to track the Heritage Group's personnel movements. His analysis revealed that they were implementing something they called a scorched earth protocol, eliminating current targets, destroying evidence, and preparing to scatter their personnel across multiple countries. They're not just running, Cooper reported. They're trying to complete their current operations while they escape. 7 people are going to die in the next 48 hours if we don't intervene. The list of immediate targets was chilling. The woman in Portland who'd married one of their operatives was scheduled for accidental carbon monoxide poisoning that night. The businessman in Vancouver was going to suffer a heart attack induced by untraceable drugs. The elderly man in San Francisco was going to die of complications from his existing medical conditions. But we have advantages they don't know about, Agent Kim pointed out. Dr. Mitchell's cooperation has given us access to their communication systems, their operational schedules, and their emergency protocols. We know what they're planning before they execute it. The key to our strategy was simultaneous action. If we moved against one cell, the others would be alerted and would accelerate their own timelines. But if we could coordinate perfectly, striking all locations at exactly the same moment, we could prevent them from warning each other and completing their murders. 0 hour is tomorrow at 6 a.m. Pacific Time, Agent Vance announced. Simultaneous raids on all operational locations, coordinated arrests of all known personnel, and immediate protective custody for all identified targets. My role in the operation was both symbolic and practical. As the head of the Morrison Trust, I had legal authority to authorize expenditures and coordinate with private security firms that normal law enforcement couldn't access quickly. But more than that, I was the primary victim whose testimony would be crucial for prosecuting the case. You'll be at a secure location during the raids, Harrison assured me, but you'll be connected to all operations through secure communications. If there are decisions that need to be made quickly, you'll have the authority to make them. The secure location was a Morrison Trust safe house in the San Juan Islands, a property that had been maintained for decades but never used. Hayes had spent the day preparing it with communication equipment, medical facilities, and security systems that would allow me to coordinate the operation while remaining protected from Heritage Group retaliation. But the most complex part of our planning involved the financial recovery operations. Owen Fletcher had identified over $200 million in recoverable assets, but seizing them would require coordinated legal action in multiple jurisdictions with precise timing. We have about a 4-hour window after the arrests begin, Owen explained. That's how long it will take for their financial systems to implement automated emergency protocols that will transfer remaining assets to accounts we can't trace or freeze. Harrison had arranged for teams of lawyers and financial specialists to be standing by at banks and investment firms across the country, ready to execute seizure orders the moment arrests began. It was a level of coordination that required resources. Only someone with the Morrison Trust's connections and financial power could arrange. We're not just stopping their current operations, Harrison emphasized. We're destroying their ability to operate permanently. Every dollar they've stolen, every resource they've accumulated, every backup plan they've made, we're taking all of it. The psychological warfare aspect was equally important. Jane Martinez had been working with FBI behavioral specialists to develop what they called disruption protocols, ways to use the Heritage Group's own communication systems against them, spreading confusion and preventing coordinated responses. They're used to being the predators, Jane explained. Tomorrow they become the prey, and predators don't react well when they suddenly find themselves being hunted. Dr. Harriet Lawson had been coordinating with medical teams at each location to ensure that poisoning victims received immediate treatment. Her analysis of the Heritage Group's methods had revealed exactly which antidotes and treatments would be needed for each type of attack they used. We can save everyone they're planning to kill, Dr. Lawson assured me, but only if we reach them, in time, and if our timing is perfect. As the final preparations concluded, I realized that we'd assembled something unprecedented, a coordinated response that matched the Heritage Group's sophistication and exceeded their resources. They'd spent 15 years building their criminal organization, but we'd built a counter-organization in less than a week. Tomorrow changes everything, Agent Vance said as our planning session concluded. Either we destroy them completely, or they disappear forever and continue killing people in countries where we can't reach them. The stakes couldn't be higher, but I felt confident for the first time since this nightmare began. The Heritage Group had targeted the wrong family. They'd assumed the Morrison Trust was just money to be stolen, not understanding that it was actually a weapon system that had been built over generations to protect against exactly their kind of threat. Tomorrow, they would learn what it meant to threaten a Morrison, and it would be the last mistake they ever made. The Morrison Trust safe house on Orcas Island felt like the calm before a storm. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the sun beginning to rise over the San Juan Islands, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. In exactly 1 hour, simultaneous operations would begin across 8 cities, and the Heritage Group's 15-year reign of terror would come to an end. Cooper Hayes had transformed the safe house's main room into a command center, with multiple screens showing live feeds from surveillance teams positioned outside Heritage Group locations. The technology was impressive, but what struck me most was the human element. Dozens of law enforcement officers and private security personnel who'd been working around the clock to make this moment possible. Final status check. Agent Vance's voice came through the secure communication system from FBI headquarters in Seattle. All teams report ready. One by one, the responses came in from across the country. Portland team ready. Vancouver team ready. San Francisco, Denver, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Miami, all confirmed and standing by. Each team had been positioned for hours, waiting for the synchronized signal that would launch the largest coordinated strike against organized financial crime in FBI history. Heritage Group communications are normal, Jane Martinez reported from her monitoring station. No indication they're aware of our preparations. Their overnight operational schedule is proceeding as planned. That schedule included the murders of 7 people who had no idea they were about to die. In Portland, the carbon monoxide system had already been installed in the target's home. In Vancouver, the cardiac drug had been prepared for injection. In San Francisco, the elderly victim's morning medication had been replaced with a lethal substitute. Medical teams are in position at all locations, Dr. Lawson confirmed. Antidotes prepared, treatment protocols ready. We can save them all if our timing is right. The financial interdiction was equally critical. Owen Fletcher had coordinated with banking authorities across multiple countries to freeze assets at precisely 6:01 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 minute after the arrests began. The Heritage Group's emergency protocols wouldn't activate until they detected law enforcement action, giving us a narrow window to trap their resources. $237 million identified for seizure, Owen reported. Account locks ready to execute. They won't be able to access their operational funds once we begin. Harrison Cooper was monitoring the legal aspects of the TAOP operation, ensuring that all search warrants, arrest warrants, and seizure orders were properly coordinated. The Morrison Trust's legal team had been working with prosecutors in 8 jurisdictions to ensure that everything would hold up in court. All warrants confirmed and ready for execution, Harrison announced. Legal teams standing by for immediate processing of evidence and assets. As 6 a.m. approached, I felt the weight of what we were about to unleash. In 60 seconds, hundreds of law enforcement officers would simultaneously breach locations across the continent. People would die if we failed, but the Heritage Group would be destroyed if we succeeded. 30 seconds, Agent Vance announced. I thought about my parents, murdered 7 years ago to set this plan in motion, about Jane, Harriet, and the other victims whose deaths had funded the Heritage Group's operations, about the 7 people who were about to be killed if we didn't act. 10 seconds. The screens showed our teams in position, weapons ready, vehicles prepared for rapid deployment. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Execute. Across 8 cities, doors exploded inward simultaneously. The final battle had begun. The simultaneous raids unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of justice. On the screens before me, I watched as federal agents and local police forces breached Heritage Group locations across the continent with military precision. The coordination was flawless. Every door, every window, every escape route covered. At exactly the same moment. Seattle team has Oscar in custody. Agent Kim's voice crackled through the communication system. No resistance. He was found in bed with forged travel documents and $50,000 in cash. My husband, though I could barely think of him that way anymore, had been arrested in what had once been our home. The surveillance footage showed him being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He'd been so confident in his plan, so certain that I would die quietly and leave him rich. Instead, he was facing life in federal prison. Portland team reports successful intervention, came the next update. Victim extracted safely. Carbon monoxide system disabled. Suspect in custody. The woman who'd married one of their operatives 6 months ago was alive. The Heritage Group had been minutes away from activating the gas system that would have killed her in her sleep, but our medical team had arrived in time to evacuate her and provide treatment for the early stages of carbon monoxide poisoning. Vancouver, successful. San Francisco, successful. Denver, successful. The reports kept coming, each one representing a life saved and a piece of the Heritage Group's network dismantled. But it was the Miami operation that provided the most dramatic footage. Angel Winters, the mastermind behind 15 years of systematic murder, had been found in a penthouse apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay, surrounded by documents she'd been frantically burning in a fireplace. Angel Winters in custody, the Miami team leader reported. Significant evidence recovered before destruction, multiple hard drives, financial records, and what appears to be target files for future operations. Seeing Angel in handcuffs on the screen was deeply satisfying. This was the woman who'd orchestrated my parents' murder, who'd planned my own death, who'd turned killing into a business model. Her expression of rage and disbelief as she was arrested was everything I'd hoped for. Financial interdiction complete, Owen Fletcher announced. $212 million in assets frozen across 43 accounts. They can't access their operational funds. The Heritage Group's sophisticated financial network had been dismantled in minutes. Years of carefully accumulated stolen wealth was now trapped in frozen accounts, awaiting distribution back to victims' families. The organization that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was suddenly broke and powerless. Medical teams report all potential victims secured, Dr. Lawson confirmed. 7 lives saved, all subjects receiving appropriate treatment for poisoning attempts. The elderly man in San Francisco had been given the lethal medication substitute, but our team had arrived with stomach pumps and activated charcoal in time to save his life. The businessman in Vancouver had been minutes away from receiving the cardiac drug injection when our agents burst through his door. Total arrests, 47 individuals across 8 cities, Agent Vance summarized. No casualties among law enforcement or civilians. Operation complete. 47 arrests. An entire criminal organization decimated in a single coordinated strike. The Heritage Group's 15-year reign of terror was over, ended by the very resources they'd tried to steal. But the most satisfying moment came when Cooper Hayes handed me a secure phone. "There's someone who wants to speak with you," he said with a rare smile. The voice on the other end was elderly but strong. "Miss Morrison? This is Judge Patricia Coleman. I wanted to personally thank you for what you've done today." Judge Coleman explained that her daughter had been one of the Heritage Group's early victims 5 years ago, a death that had been ruled a suicide despite the family's suspicions. "Today's arrests have given us the evidence we need to reopen her case and get justice for our family." Similar calls came throughout the day. Families who'd lost loved ones to suspicious circumstances, who'd been told their cases were closed, who'd never believed the official explanations for their relatives' deaths. The Heritage Group's captured records contained evidence of dozens of additional murders, giving closure to families who'd been grieving without answers for years. The counterattack had succeeded beyond our wildest expectations. We hadn't just stopped the Heritage Group. We'd exposed their entire 15-year operation and provided justice for all their victims. The trials began 6 months later, and they dominated headlines across the country. The Heritage Group case became the largest organized crime prosecution in the history of financial fraud, with evidence so overwhelming that most defendants chose to cooperate rather than face life sentences. Oscar was among the first to break. Faced with recordings of his conversations about my murder, DNA evidence linking him to the ricin poisoning, and testimony from Dr. Mitchell about their conspiracy, he agreed to a plea deal that would put him in federal prison for 35 years without possibility of parole. I attended his sentencing hearing, the first time I'd seen him in person since waking up in the hospital. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and shackles. When the judge asked if he had anything to say to his victims, Oscar finally looked at me directly. "I'm sorry," he said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. Even his apology felt calculated, designed to earn sympathy from the court rather than express genuine remorse. "No, you're not," I replied when given the opportunity to address him. "You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry your plan failed. But you're not sorry for what you did to me, or to my parents, or to the other women you killed. And that's exactly why you'll spend the rest of your life in prison." Angel Winters received life without parole. The judge called her a predator, who weaponized trust and love to commit some of the most callous murders in modern history. She showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, maintaining that she'd simply been running a business that provided services people wanted. Dr. Mitchell's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence of 15 years, but his medical license was permanently revoked, and he faced additional civil suits from families of patients he'd helped murder. His testimony was crucial in securing convictions for the entire network. The financial recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. Owen Fletcher's forensic accounting work had identified not just the Heritage Group's current assets, but money they'd stolen and invested over 15 years of operations. The final recovery totaled over $400 million. "Every victim's family will receive full restitution," Owen reported during one of our final meetings. "In many cases, they'll receive more than was originally stolen, thanks to investment returns on the recovered funds." The Morrison Trust established a victim assistance fund with the excess recovered money, providing ongoing support for families affected by financial crimes. Harrison Cooper suggested it be named the Morrison-Patterson Fund, honoring both my family and the victims who'd suffered at the Heritage Group's hands. But the most meaningful moment came when Detective Reeves called to tell me about a conversation she'd had with Agent Kim. His sister's death had been officially reclassified as murder, and her case was closed with the Heritage Group's convictions. "He wanted me to thank you specifically," Detective Reeves said. "He said his family finally has peace because you refused to let them get away with it." The ripple effects continued for months. Law enforcement agencies across the country reopened suspicious death cases, finding Heritage Group connections in dozens of previously unsolved murders. Banking regulations were strengthened to prevent the kind of systematic exploitation the group had used. Medical oversight procedures were enhanced to detect the kind of conspiracy Dr. Mitchell had facilitated. Most importantly, 7 people were alive who would have been dead if we hadn't acted. They attended a gathering Harrison organized at the Morrison Trust offices, a chance for survivors to meet and support each other. Seeing them alive, healthy, and rebuilding their lives was worth everything we'd endured to stop the Heritage Group. The media attention was intense, but ultimately positive. The case became a textbook example of how private resources could be used to support law enforcement in complex investigations. Harvard Business School developed a case study about the Morrison Trust's response, examining how family wealth could be deployed for social good. But for me, the most important outcome was personal. I'd survived, I'd sought justice for my parents, and the other victims, and I'd ensured that the Heritage Group could never hurt anyone else. The nightmare that had begun with a poisoned anniversary dinner was finally over. 2 years after the Heritage Group's destruction, I stood in the conference room of the Morrison Trust's new headquarters, looking out at the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The building itself was a testament to how much had changed. Instead of the discreet, almost secretive offices the Trust had maintained for decades, we now occupied a gleaming tower in downtown Seattle with Morrison, Center for Justice, etched in granite above the entrance. The transformation hadn't just been physical. The near loss of everything had taught me that the Morrison family's true legacy wasn't the money we'd accumulated, but the responsibility that came with it. The Trust now operated as much more than a wealth preservation vehicle. It had become a force for protecting others from the kind of predators that had nearly destroyed me. The Peterson Foundation just approved our application for the Anti-Fraud Initiative, Jane Martinez announced as she entered the conference room. Jane had left nursing to become the director of victim services for what we now called the Morrison Justice Foundation. Her background in both law enforcement and healthcare made her invaluable in identifying and supporting people who'd been targeted by financial predators. The Peterson Foundation grant would fund our expansion into 3 new states, providing resources for investigating suspicious deaths and supporting families who suspected their loved ones had been murdered for financial gain. In the 2 years since the Heritage Group's fall, we'd already helped solve 14 additional murder cases and prevented at least 6 attempted killings. Dr. Chen wants to discuss the medical training program, Jane continued. She's identified 12 hospitals that need better protocols for detecting poisoning attempts. Dr. Sarah Chen, the physician who'd saved my life, had joined our foundation as medical director. Her experience treating ricin poisoning had led to groundbreaking research in toxicology detection, and she now trained emergency room doctors across the country to recognize the signs of deliberate poisoning that medical professionals too often missed. Cooper Hayes appeared in the doorway, his expression serious as always, but with a hint of satisfaction that had become more common lately. The Vancouver task force made 3 arrests this morning, he reported. Financial fraud targeting elderly immigrants, same patterns we've been tracking. Cooper had established what he called the Heritage Protocol, a systematic approach to identifying and dismantling criminal networks that targeted wealthy individuals. Law enforcement agencies across North America now used our techniques and resources to investigate complex financial crimes that had previously been beyond their capabilities. The Foundation's success had attracted attention from an unexpected source. Harrison Cooper knocked on the open door, followed by a woman I recognized from news broadcasts, Senator Elizabeth Warren, who served on the Senate Banking Committee. "Miss Morrison," Senator Warren said, extending her hand, "I've been following your foundation's work with great interest. We'd like to discuss federal legislation that would make your approaches standard practice nationwide. The proposed legislation would require banks to implement monitoring systems for the kind of systematic asset stripping the Heritage Group had perfected. It would mandate training for medical professionals to detect deliberate poisoning. Most importantly, it would create federal funding for victim assistance programs like ours. What you've built here goes beyond justice for your own case," Senator Warren continued. "You've created a model for how private resources can be used to protect vulnerable people and hold criminals accountable. This could change how we approach financial crimes permanently." As the senator left to tour our facilities, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I'd been a successful graphic designer who'd never given much thought to the Morrison family legacy beyond the trust fund that would activate on my 35th birthday. I'd lived comfortably but quietly, focused on my business and personal happiness. The Heritage Group's attack had stripped away that comfortable anonymity. They'd murdered my parents, poisoned me, stolen my money, and nearly succeeded in eliminating the Morrison bloodline entirely. But in trying to destroy me, they'd awakened something far more dangerous to their kind. A Morrison who understood the full scope of her family's power and was willing to use it. The foundation now employed over 60 people and had an annual budget exceeding $50 million. We'd helped prosecute dozens of financial predators, saved countless lives, and created systems that would protect future generations from the kind of organized theft and murder the Heritage Group had perfected. But the most important change was personal. I'd survived an attempt to murder me for money, discovered that my parents had been killed for the same reason, and learned that the comfortable life I'd built was actually built on a foundation of privilege and responsibility I'd never fully understood. The Morrison Trust had been created over a century ago to preserve wealth for future generations. But I'd learned that true preservation meant more than just maintaining money. It meant using that money to ensure that others could build the same kind of comfortable, secure lives that I'd taken for granted. Standing in that conference room, looking out at a city where families were safer because of the work we'd done, I finally understood what my great-grandfather had really been building. Not just a fortune, but a legacy of protection that would outlast any individual Morrison and continue to... Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.